We're delighted that our next panelist could join us. Stanley Fischer, of course, is the Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, has agreed to a conversation with Tim Adams. Before we bring them on stage, we've got another polling question. This is sort of the critical question facing us, other than the election, what's going to happen with the Fed. And we had the employment report this morning that was sort of Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cool. So grab your mobile devices now, and we got a pretty simple question. Do you think the Fed will hike before the end of the year, which would mean the December meeting? Presumably they're not going to raise interest rates a few days before the presidential election, though they won't tell us that, but I can't imagine that happening. So yes or no, Fed hike by the end of the year? So we're at 62.5 on 60 on yes, 40 on no. I think that is sort of the Wall Street consensus that December is pretty likely, given where wages are. So anyway, you don't need to hear from me on that. You can hear from Stan Fischer himself. So let me please welcome to the stage, again, Tim Adams and Stan Fischer, the Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have with me today a dear friend, but someone who I have admired and followed for my entire professional career, who's done a little bit of everything, and who's probably trained more economists and industry leaders than just about anyone else. So it's been a real pleasure to have Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Stan Fischer, with us here today. He's probably forgotten more about economics than I ever will know. But Stan, thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you very much for coming here today. We appreciate it. Ben was just up here. He described the numbers we saw, the jobs numbers this morning, wages and such as Goldilocks. Is it Goldilocks?
It's pretty close. We think of the range in which the market is producing enough jobs to keep unemployment from rising at a fixed participation rate. What it did today, the participation rate went up, the unemployment rate went up. Those two things are fine. It means employment was going at a rate that is fully consistent with keeping unemployment declining somewhat further.
And wages starting to pick up?
Well, the wage change of 2.6% is closer to 3 than it is to 2. I have a friend age 70 who said, when you ask how old he is, he says, I am closer to 60 than to 50.
That's good. All right. We'll go with that. How do you see the economy generally then, if just generalize?
Well, the problem in the economy is the difference between the remarkable success of policy in reducing unemployment, and this is almost global actually, and the very low rate of growth of GDP. Unemployment is somewhere very close to the natural rate. I think we're close to full employment, and growth isn't close to what we used to think of as normal. And it's two things: it's productivity growth, it's the rate of growth of productivity plus the very low rate of investment, and they're obviously connected.
Right.
And that part of the story is less pleasing, and that's what's worrying people, and that's what has consequences for the long run and for the short run. I mean, for the long run, I think we used to think that the standard of living of our children would be about double of that of ours. That's not the situation now. We're not growing that fast. And right. We've actually had negative productivity growth for the last 3 quarters, which is possible. It's not that you forget how to produce things. It's just that the mix moves from from high productivity to low productivity goods. But the story is one which was very important to change. It will change at some point because we're not going to go with negative productivity growth forever, even for very long. But precisely what it'll go back to is not clear. I think there are a lot of estimates of about 1.5% per annum. It used to be over 2. And I learned many things from a person who many of you here have heard of, Herbert Stein, who used to be Richard Nixon's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, who always used to say, the difference between a growth rate of 1% and 2% is 100%. And that is absolutely true. If you look over 30 years, you double at 2% and you don't double at 1%. You'd be about half after 35 years of where you would be if you were growing at 2%. So these have very important consequences for the long run, these low numbers. And everybody is trying to find out what's going on.
Well, you gave a speech yesterday, which I've scurried to read last night because I didn't know you were reading it. You were giving it, but you talk about long-term interest rates, cyclical versus structural, and you and I have had this discussion about productivity and the weakness of investment. Investment just hasn't shown up in this recovery. U.S. corporations sitting on $2 trillion worth of cash. Boardrooms really aren't interested in capital expansion. Why do you think investment's been so weak? Why is it the missing ingredient? And what must happen before we see an acceleration?
Well, part of it, investment was higher before the oil price started falling. And in the United States, the decline in the price of oil, which not coincidentally is essentially to a level below which investment in production of shale is marginal, and therefore the production of the capital goods needed to expand production disappears. So we lost a lot of investment through the decline in shale production in the price of oil. But over and above that, you've got a lot of firms sitting on a lot of cash, even firms sitting on cash in the United States. And there's a sort of air of uncertainty about the situation that I think is not encouraging of investment. If you were a Keynesian, you'd say animal spirits aren't there.
Right.
And people aren't excited about growth prospects. Now, that has something to do with productivity and with inventions. And, you know, when you're getting pessimistic about inventions, then you look at what happened at the Nobel Prize 2 days in a row.
Right.
One day, people get the prize for learning the properties of matter at very close to zero, an absolute zero of temperature. The next day, they get a prize for being able to design machines that work at molecular level. Somewhere, 25 years from now, we'll be aware of these Nobel Prizes again. But what it will take to generate from them industrial production has still to be invented, and we don't know at what rate that will happen. There's a very interesting result that has come out of the OECD looking at the diffusion of technology. It turns out that the rate of growth of productivity of the leading firms in industry has not declined relative to the pre-recession levels. It's the same. The diffusion is way down.
Right.
And so it's not spreading into the industry. Now, what exactly is happening? You don't know why it isn't spreading. It can't be that the cost of investing is expensive. It's close to zero in terms of financial costs. So something hasn't turned confidence on, and confidence has to be turned on to get people to want to invest. So we're waiting to see that happen. It will happen at some point, but precisely when matters.
So further digital deepening in certain sectors. We've also done our own work that shows that those sectors that are most, exposed to trade tend to be more productive as well. The non-tradable sector, housing, healthcare, education, are those sectors, which are huge, a part of the economy. We've seen very little or no productivity. So I know trade is not in vogue anymore, and I'm going to speak to that in a moment. But it really is about openness and these winds of change that forces companies to innovate and invest.
Yeah, and that's also the difference between this service sector and manufacturing sector. I mean, productivity growth has been higher in the manufacturing sector. That's where you're looking for it. but it's in a sector that's declining in size, not in size of output,
Right.
but in size of employment. That's where the productivity growth has been very high.
And have there been policies or policy missteps or positive policies that have exacerbated the investment paucity problem that we have?
Well, certainly if you talk to businessmen, that's what you hear. But the problem with that is there hasn't been a change in the level of complaints about excess regulation since before the crisis and what we have now. So I don't know to what extent that's true, but I am impressed by how much you hear about it. And it's certainly something that at some point somebody who's serious about growth is going to have to go through the regulatory framework and figure out how to change it. I'm attracted, I'm sure many of you have read famous works by late economist called Mansell Olson, who tried to find out why it is that after World War II the countries that were defeated grew faster than the countries that won the war. And his conclusion was that every healthy country with a democracy gets a lot of cobwebs on it in the course of time. Political compromises are made, and those compromises tend not to go away because you had to buy off these people and that people in the political process. And what a good defeat does is it wipes all that stuff away and you can start again. Well, that may not be what we should be looking for, but it is certainly true that there is something like that hanging around in the Western economies, which have been here for a very long time, growing for a very long period without much civil strife, and there could be something to that. But what it'll take is not a war, but a political change.
But there are other forces at work as well. The nature, the structure of the economy is changing. We're much more digital, services oriented. We're demographics, we're a population that's growing much older. In fact, one of the challenges among the emerging markets is that they're deindustrializing and growing older before they have the human capital that sets them up to compete with respect to services in a digitized economy. But is some of the story of productivity, or the absence of productivity, is it because of the structural changes in the economy? And are we still stuck in a 20th century mindset of widgets and production when in fact it really is about platforms and Uber and other kinds of service providers?
Well, it may be, but the point about all that is there's so much going on that relates to productivity in the service sector, which comes out of the IT revolution. And there are so many industries that simply couldn't operate. The airline industry couldn't operate without the computer systems on which enable them to run many more flights without many more people.
Right.
And same thing in the medical system, all over the place. It's there, but it never shows up in the data. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that some of the output isn't measured. I think Marty Feldstein has been heard to say that
Right.
the output of Google, the output of Facebook doesn't show up in the GDP data. And there are a lot of people who argue that consumer surplus, which is what is it that the consumer gets out of the economy, has in fact continued to grow at roughly the rate it had before. It's just that the non-measured parts of GDP have been growing. I don't think that's been established, but it's a possibility that you could see. So I think there's something to do with the structure of the economy, particularly the growing role of services that could be responsible for this. Now, there's, as you know, Tim, there's a mismeasurement argument.
Right.
There's a
Right.
very nice article called, "Does the United States have a productivity problem or a data problem?" The data being that we may mismeasure productivity. Well, the answer of most economists who really looked at this is it has a data problem, but it cannot account for the decline that we see in the measured data.
Right. Robert Gordon has written a tome. Someone described it as the weight of a small dog. It was the review in the New York Times Review of Books, who said that there was this miraculous century, 1870 and 1970, and all the great inventions have occurred. And then we got our friend Andy McAfee, who's at MIT, that says, no, that really is, we're on the cusp of something great. Who's got the story right?
Well, Bob Solow was at MIT, is at MIT, still as an emeritus professor, who said in the early 1990s, the computer revolution is everywhere except in the GDP data. And 2 years later, it showed up in the GDP data magnificently for about 10 years. So I go with McAfee, because I'm also from MIT, so we have to stick together. But I mean, what Bob Gordon's really said is all the great employment-creating technology improvements were invented. He's talking about simple things like flush toilets, electricity, transportation, cars, planes.
Now, I grew up in Kentucky. Some of those things were late in life, so.
I know. I grew up even with less of those things than you did. So in what was then northern Rhodesia. So we didn't have that stuff either. But you can surmount it. That,
yes.
You know.
Well, but these changes that have been profound that Robert Gordon has talked about and Andy has had an impact on the labor force and certainly political discourse, which we're not going to get into. But the hollowing out of certain jobs, certain sectors of the economy more exposed to being competed away because of technology. How do you think about the changes that are going on in the workforce as you make monetary policy?
Well, I mean, as we make monetary policy, the truth is we look mainly at the macro data. We go into the details of who's unemployed to see if there's something we're doing in monetary policy that's affecting the distribution of unemployment, which usually we don't think we have a precise tool to get at this group or that group. I think about it as we have a workforce that comes equipped with a certain education. If you're 50 years old, you have trouble operating your computer, and it's kind of irritating when your grandchildren show up with no knowledge of computers and fix a problem that you have on your machine. And they just have a different system in their heads already, and we don't have that. At least you may have it, I don't. And we have a workforce which the people who are very upset are the older people, and modern technology is different, and they didn't learn it, and we think that it's affecting them more than it's affecting younger people. Is that something we can deal with? Well, there are retraining programs. A colleague of mine went somewhere in Philadelphia and went to see a retraining program and was very impressed. Said actually a lot of these people came out with some other skills which enabled them to work, more modern skills. So it can be done, that much is clear. But how we're going to get investment in that area, other than through markets, I mean, whether the government will get into this, is a matter that we need to hope happens, and we'll see if it does happen.
There's a wonderful new book out entitled The 100-Year Life by two professors at the London School of Economics that, based on their numbers, my children, early teens, will live to be 105. They have a 60% probability to live to 105. They will work into their mid-80s. If you think about the pace of technological change, the idea of having a single career is then obsolete. You'll probably have 3 or 4 distinct careers. So the way we think about education, pensions, savings has to change radically.
Well, it has to, and it's sometimes politically difficult. Just a little example. In Israel, they raised the retirement age. For men, they raised it immediately. For women, it was going to be implemented starting 3 years after. but there was going to be a separate vote on it. Between the time they passed the law and they had the vote, the women mobilized, and this was a law which was important from the viewpoint of budget. So I called the finance minister after the vote and said, "How did it go?" He said, "Well, there was one vote for raising the retirement age of women, and it was mine." And that was it. People
Right.
don't like that very much, but it's going to happen. It's going to have to happen.
We have no choice. The current system doesn't work.
Right.
But I'm going to touch back on part of the political discourse is that there's a whole portion of the population that feels that this miraculous set of we've seen remarkable growth, and we've seen a reduction in inequality between countries, even though we've seen some inequality within countries. Globally, since 1990, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. We've had the ranks of the middle class, global middle class, rise by hundreds of millions. In some ways, the last 20 years has been pretty remarkable. But there are people who feel like they haven't been a part of that. What do we do about that?
Well, the trend that you're describing can be explained very simply through a peculiar set of facts, which is that while inequality has typically increased in most countries, global inequality has declined. As if you lined up all the people in the world, because you've moved 1 billion or something Chinese and several hundred million Indians from the bottom to the middle. The distribution of income in the world is more equal than it used to be, but each country has a problem, and the politics runs in each country, not so much that people don't take great satisfaction that some other country people are living better. So that problem is out there, and we've got to deal with it at the national level. That has to do with our educational systems. It has to do with education for people who've left school. And those things have to be taken seriously, and you have to look at other countries. You have to look at what the Scandinavians do. They seem to do this pretty well. And whether our society will be willing to do that is something we need to explore and not announce, well, that's the Scandinavians, we can't do that. We need to see if we can do that and then try to do it.
I agree. Before and you went to Scandinavia, I'm going to go global in a minute, but I want to go back to regulation. I'm going to loop in one of the questions about if regulation is a potential inhibitor to growth, should we do a better job of measuring its impact? And the corollary to that is, with respect to financial regulation, have we done enough? 7 years after the crisis, been sweeping changes. I articulated some of that this morning. So do we have enough regulation with respect to the financial sector, enough to avoid financial instability? And should we be thinking about measuring the regulatory impact across all sectors?
Well, there's a lot of desire to have cost-benefit analysis of every regulatory measure, and nothing could happen unless the cost-benefit analysis turns out to be that's positive. Trouble is, these analyses are very imprecise, and if you started on that, what you'd end up doing is make a living for lawyers, and that's another way of getting growth, but probably not getting productivity growth. So you need to do it on big things, and you need to make the arguments. Whether it has to be numerical,
right,
is another issue. You've got to argue what it is you think you're doing by increasing regulation. On the financial side, I'm pretty sure that the big goals of the reform of regulation that took place in Dodd-Frank have been achieved in certain areas, namely the banking sector. And I worry a little bit about the fact that we in the United States do not have very good mechanisms for dealing with the non-bank sector, with the shadow banking system. So that is something that has to be looked at again.
Is there particular aspects of market-based financing that you find more interesting? What leads you to be worried? Maybe you're not worried. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you want to focus on it. Why, and what about it makes you want to focus on it?
Well, it's simply that we don't have the public sector doesn't have a whole lot of information about what's going on in various sectors which are very active in the shadow banking system. And we also have in the United States relatively few tools for dealing with this. You listen to people saying, well, yeah, we've got bank regulation, that's okay. And if it isn't banking, we've got interest rates to deal with banks, we've got regulation. And for the rest, we'll use macroprudential measures to deal with them. Right. Well, macroprudential measures are non-interest measures typically thought of as regulatory, to deal with problems in the financial sector. We have relatively few macroprudential measures in the United States. The Europeans have a lot of them. The Scandinavians have even more. If you're a good regulator, you can use those things. We can't. I can't say we can't. We do have some measures. It's not hopeless. But we have much less. And so I can't say that I am frightened about a particular thing. You can always point to things that happened in the past. In the United States, a year and a half ago, we were worried about leveraged lending.
Right.
We made a lot of noise about it. We spoke to the banks that were involved in part of the chain in those loans, and the level went down. And that doesn't seem like a threat at the moment. So a regulator can do a lot, but things will happen. I'm very worried when people ask me, so far you haven't, have we solved the too big to fail problem? My view on that is that a regulator or an intelligence agency never knows whether it's solved a particular problem. And if they tell you we have solved the too big to fail problem, you should dismiss them and get somebody else who actually understands that you're in a battle to understand what's going on around you, and that one of the things you have to keep asking yourself is, what will I do if there's an accident? And how do I build up defenses against one of these agencies getting into a problem of which we never thought? And as a regulator, I used to spend most of my time wandering around, convinced that while I was looking here and there for a problem, there was one coming from over there somewhere that was about to hit us, like the great financial crisis did in the United States. So you've got to be watching the whole time on that. So I don't know precisely what we can do to make this all better, but I think we've done a lot to make it better.
You mentioned too big to fail. I wasn't, but I must say I don't understand the obsession about size, and it seems like breaking up the banks is a solution to every problem. The hurricanes blowing up the west or the east coast of Florida. I'm sure some congressman tomorrow will say we need to break up the banks because of the hurricane. It seems to be the constant refrain. But the first crisis I ever worked on in Washington was the S&L crisis, and I was in the White House as a young staffer at the time. We put together Trust Resolution Corporation. 400 institutions went under. We had a recession, and it cost the president I was working for at the time his job. So oftentimes, as you just note, crises come from small places or interconnected places or places we didn't think about. Washington Mutual was an S&L, IndyMac was an S&L. Don't we spend an awful lot of time thinking about some of these really large institutions? We have J.P. Morgan coming up at lunch. They have a $500 billion worth of equity capital. Do you really worry so much about those kinds of metrics?
Well, you have to look at them. That's the first line of defense or the last line of defense. I'm not sure which.
Right.
And you have to make sure that they've got the ability to withstand adverse effects. That's why the stress tests are among the most important changes in supervision that have been introduced since the crisis. I mean, the banks dislike the large amount of work that's involved. You've got a system, you've got to test it. Right. And those tests are pretty serious, and I think, on the whole, a desirable development.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the global environment. We're now 5 straight years of sub 3% growth. The fund has come out with their new WEO forecasting growth about 3% next year globally. they mark down the U.S. Trade has grown faster than global GDP prior to the crisis, is now growing at about half the rate. What's going on in the global economy? How do you think about growth going forward?
What I think is that the nature of growth matters, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In the 1990s, during the Asian crisis, if you wandered around the countries bordering China, they all were concerned that they were going to be outcompeted by China. And it was growing too fast. And I used to say, would you rather have a neighbor who's prosperous or a neighbor who's poor to trade with? Well, that sort of shifted the debate a little bit. But, and I thought what mattered was the size of the unit you're trading with. I think what they're buying matters a great deal as well. What happened what we learned in this crisis from the slowdown in Chinese growth and its impact, they're still growing at a phenomenally fast rate by historical standards. Whether it's 6% or 7%, those are superb growth rates. But their impact on trade has declined, on the economies of which they used to trade, has gone down a lot. And I reached the conclusion that actually, because a lot of their trade was in goods, including raw materials, that were most useful in investment, that it was the rate of growth of China's trade that mattered possibly just as much as the growth rate of the economy as a whole. And that's where you see this transmission of trade. I mean, Chinese growth rate went from 10 to, let's say, 6. You look at the west coast of Africa, you look at the west coast of Latin America and the east coast of Latin America, they've all gone down phenomenally because of what happened in China. It's not the only thing that happened. But to go from a situation where when I was in the IMF and you were in the administration, or you'd left already, we used to think that world trade grew at twice the rate of the world economy. We now see that it's growing at the rate of the world economy. Well, that's a huge, huge difference. It's related to the nature of Chinese growth. It's also related to the nature of production. They're outsourcing less to their neighbors, as we are outsourcing less, actually, as well at the moment. So the level of trade has gone down. I don't think the importance of trade as an instrument, as a growth machine, has gone down. And what worries me about the anti-globalization is the view that, well, globalization is useless. We ought to go back to worrying about ourselves. You worry about yourself and you start shutting yourself off from global growth and global markets. And there are very few countries which have succeeded in growing rapidly over sustained periods without integrating into the global economy. And that's the great fear that I have of what's going on politically all over the world at the moment.
I completely agree, and I'm going to offer some thoughts on that in just a few minutes. I was actually in Johannesburg last week. We had our Africa Summit, and the number one question, a little bit about U.S. politics, was about our outlook on China. And if you were on the West Coast from Angola or Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria, it was all about commodity prices. Interestingly, East Africa seemed to be doing a little bit better.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, yeah.
I'm trying to bring some good news.
Thanks.
The other issue which we've been discussing, and the fund touched on this week, is the level of indebtedness. If you look at the household sector, the sovereign sector, the corporate sector, just about anywhere in the world, advanced economies, emerging economies, we've seen the economy's leveraged up. The fund's numbers are 253% of global GDP. Our numbers are a lot higher than that because we fold in the financial sector. But inevitably, we've seen this long trend of ever more indebtedness. But we've seen productivity decline. How do you think about it? Do you worry about the amount of debt that is growing and our capacity to service that debt?
Well, there are two parts of the answer. The one is that in terms of the capacity to service the debt service has not gone up anything like the amount that debt has gone up because interest rates are very, very low. And so the interest burden, which is the servicing burden, has not risen anywhere like the numbers which have doubled and so forth for debt. But interest rates are very low, and I don't think I'm revealing any secrets if I say that at least one member of the Federal Reserve Board thinks that interest rates will be higher 5 years from now than they are today. And that will make a difference to the amount of debt servicing. So these things are big, and there's a bump in debt servicing that awaits countries. Now, the theory was there'd be a temporary period, you'd expand your government finance, or firms would expand their investment, and then the economy would grow and you could pay it off because the ratio to GDP was less. Well, because growth is less, that's become a problem. It's no longer that particular story doesn't fill you with joy because parts of the mechanism that was involved in it have broken down.
And as you're sitting in your policymaking job at the FOMC, how important is the global environment, these international issues to you? Obviously, we live in an integrated global economy, financial sector. Confidence moves on a Bloomberg screen in a nanosecond. How do you take into consideration the global environment?
Well, I mean, again, if you take a look at Fed statements of policy, you'll realize that the external world entered those statements very rarely until recently. And the external world was described in the most general of terms. You didn't relate to China and the European Monetary Union, etc. It was externally the economy, blah, 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 the dollar is strengthened, but you didn't go into details because they didn't matter very much for this economy. Now we really write about what's happening where, and Chinese events have an impact on us. This is a very interesting historical fact. At the end of World War II, the United States economy accounted for half of world GDP, right. Which is truly astounding number. It now accounts for about 23% of world GDP. I don't think the importance of the United States economy in the world economy has declined as much as 50 to 23. And I think it's because of the role of the capital markets. There were no market flows of capital at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. It is massive now. What we do here affects the whole world. If we didn't know that before, wherever we go and meet with foreigners, they tell me, and I've got a relative in South Africa who wrote to me and said, could you please explain to me why what you guys do sitting in an office in Washington has such a big influence on us? Well, I mean, I tried. I'm not sure I succeeded. That influence is very big now, but it depends on what's happening on the other side of our monetary policy. And so we think about it. In the end, we go back to the law, and the law is that we take into account, our policies are aimed at the United States economy. Right. Sometimes that means we have to take account of what happens abroad as a result of our policies, because what happens abroad affects the impact of our policies. So we do take those things into account, but we don't systematically say, well, it's good for the world that the world grows faster, and it's your job in the Fed to help the world grow faster. That is illegal in the United States terminology. We don't do it. But we do take care of we do take into account what happens in foreign economies.
We've had a number of bankers on the stage all morning long, and one of them said they thought global investment, was weighed down by fear, lack of confidence, and political risk. It's tough to put that in your models. It's tough for any of us to put in there. But how do you, the qualitative aspects of challenges in the global economy, how do you bring that into the way in which you think about the trajectory of policy?
Well, you can say you've got a model which tells you how what's happening abroad affects the United States economy. If you think that something that those have changed, there are very crude ways of going into the equations for those countries and saying what their reaction to the United States is. They inelegantly are called fudge factors.
Right.
More elegantly, they're called special conditions. And you can do that, and you get an idea. Do you get a precise idea? No. But could anyone get a precise idea? No. But you can take those things into account, and you'll know which way they'll affect you and which way they'll affect the decision you ought to make.
This will be the last question. Last night we had a reception at the IF focused on artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, and we had, 8 or 9 young, smart computer scientists who basically said, I'm going to be replaced by a computer and a robot pretty soon. I get that. I have John Taylor on the stage later this afternoon who says maybe monetary policy should be very rules-based. He has a rule in mind. How do you think about going back to more rules-based versus discretion? Have we gone too far in discretion? And will we be at a time where computers are basically going to run monetary policy?
Well, you have no idea how much computer time we use for the average FOMC meeting. We get a book full of computer simulations and so forth, telling us what will happen if we do A or B or C or D. So it's already there. Now, as to rules versus discretion, I believe that the Taylor rule is a useful description of the average behavior of central banks of the Fed or of other central banks over lengthy periods. And we do look at what the Taylor rule would say. We not only do that, we have a variety of vintages of Taylor rule. If you do Taylor 99, you get this. If you do something else, you get that. But in the end, we preserve the freedom not to follow any of those rules exactly, because they're describing average conditions. We are in very special conditions still, so you make adjustments. You don't do precisely what those rules say, but it's not that you ignore them. And the other thing I would say is discretion always sounds like it's sort of ad hoc and so forth. It's anything but ad hoc. And the reason it isn't ad hoc is you've got to write a statement afterwards and explain why you did what you did. And that's really important. That's also part of a rule, writing. So I don't think we're at a stage where we could use a rule permanently. Every rule that's ever been used for monetary policy is broken down. The gold standard, the fixed exchange rate system, and money targets, and so forth. And there's the famous statement by a Canadian governor, we didn't give up on monetary targeting, money gave up on us. And the world changes, and there are laws which say that.
Well, I sleep better night knowing that you're making decisions at the Fed. I hope you stay there a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, Vice Chairman Stan Fischer.